Is Sonic the Hedgehog still good? It seems like a silly question to ask, doesn't it? After all, Sonic the Hedgehog's debut in the fall of 1991 is what allowed Sega's 2-year-old system to go toe-to-toe with the brand new Super Nintendo during the 1991 holiday season, and maintain momentum for the next 3 years. The Super Nintendo would of course go on to outsell the Genesis after the dust settled thanks to longer support and a better Japanese presence, but for a few years, this little blue hedgehog absolutely disrupted the status quo and cemented himself as an icon of a decade. Sadly, thanks to a rocky transition into the third dimension, some quality inconsistencies, and gaming habits shifting away from the once dominant platforming genre, Sonic the Hedgehog just doesn't have the same impact he once did. This has all led up to a shift in the way a new generation of gamers perceive the original Sonic the Hedgehog trilogy. With a lack of nostalgia for the series due to the aforementioned issues, gamers and critics don't view Sonic's origins with the same fondness I myself have. This brings us to the topic of today's video. If I take a step back from my nostalgia and really look at Sonic the Hedgehog, will I find a game that is starting to show its age? Is there a reason Sonic the Hedgehog isn't viewed as fondly as, say, Super Mario Bros.? Or is Sonic the Hedgehog still a revolutionary title that no longer receives the respect it deserves? It's a tough question for sure, but I think I'm finally ready to tackle it, so let's dive in. The story of Sonic the Hedgehog is pretty simple. On a mysterious island, simply called South Island, there are 6 Chaos Emeralds said to hold immense power. Dr. Robotnik, aka Eggman, encapsulates the local critters inside robots and sends them on a quest to locate the 6 emeralds for his, world domination plans or something. Sonic the Hedgehog is our hero who serves little purpose other than to set things right, free his furry friends, and foil Eggman's plans. There is a hero, there is a villain, and we're off. Sonic the Hedgehog opens with Green Hill Zone, a lush green area meant to ease us into the game. Sonic can run and jump, and that's it. Sonic the Hedgehog is just a single button affair. Of course, there are some nuances. For one, when Sonic jumps, he turns into a ball, capable of defeating most enemies. Second, if you press the down button while in motion, you again turn into a ball and can crash through designated walls and, of course, take out enemies. If you're moving down a slope, you can gain additional momentum while pressing down, giving Sonic his trademark speed. This combination of speed and ability to smash through almost anything while curled up in a ball gave Sonic a distinct gimmick unlike anything else at the time. However, Sonic wasn't just about speed. There is a heavy platforming element as well. Most of the levels in Sonic the Hedgehog have multiple paths, rather than being a strictly linear experience. If you stop, you'll notice alternate routes. Jumping along moving platforms will often yield additional rings along with monitors containing goodies. The monitors can contain any number of items, including extra lives, invincibility, speed shoes, a shield, and 10 rings. Rings are to Sonic what coins are to Mario. If you manage to procure 100, you'll earn an extra life. However, if you run into an enemy or spikes, you'll lose all of your rings. In this sense, the rings act a bit like a hit point, and if you have a ring, you're never in too much danger of death. However, there is an incentive not to get too sloppy, as you'll want to rack up extra lives. After making your way through the 3 acts of Green Hill Zone, you'll arrive at a boss fight against Eggman. Like the rest of the Green Hill Zone, this isn't too tough at all. Just jump into Eggman 8 times and he'll retreat. The end of the zone is marked with a capsule containing even more critters captured by Robotnik. Jump on this to free them, and it's off to Marble Zone. The pattern of 3 acts and a boss fight is continued throughout the game's 6 zones, meaning there are 18 acts to play in all. Unlike Green Hill Zone, Marble Zone puts a greater emphasis on Sonic's platforming prowess rather than sheer speed. This means jumping, and a lot of it. The 3 acts are littered with moving platforms, either horizontally or vertically, and is a sharp contrast to the first area. Thankfully, the controls in Sonic the Hedgehog are more than up to the task. Of all the criticism directed towards the classic Sonic games, no one ever complains about the controls, and this is because they are damn near perfect. Seriously. Sonic builds up momentum at just the right pace. It isn't too fast, making leaping from small platforms slippery, but isn't too slow to make jumping awkward or difficult. Instead, it's just right and makes segments like these a ton of fun, rather than frustrating. Things are not perfect, however. While Green Hill Zone can be breezed through without taking damage rather easily, Marble Zone isn't designed with quite the same care. Placement of spikes feels a bit sloppy at times, and their placement doesn't always fit the flow of the level. There are a few moments where you'll be surprised by a spike as Sonic the Hedgehog basically forces you into one. Thankfully, in both of these examples, I was fortunate enough to have a shield and hang on to my collection of rings, but newcomers to the title might not be so lucky. Enemy placement is sometimes cheap as well, with an enemy dropping down while you are moving up, giving you absolutely no time to react to the threat. These are minor issues for sure, but noteworthy nonetheless. Moving on then, Eggman is back to try and take down the blue blur. Despite looking completely different, this battle plays out a lot like the first. You need to get in your hits and then jump to the other side of the screen to avoid his attacks. I actually find this to be a nice progression, mixing in the patterns learned with the previous encounter and then upping the ante with a pit of lava. After 8 hits, Eggman retreats and Sonic finds himself in Springyard Zone. The acts of Springyard Zone play like a mix of Green Hill's speed and Marble Zone's platforming. There are plenty of springs and straight sections allowing Sonic to gain some serious speed, but also plenty of tight sections requiring patience and proficient platforming to succeed. However, my favorite aspect of Springyard Zone is all of the secret nooks and crannies. If you keep your eyes open, you'll notice little openings in the set pieces, allowing you to snatch up some bonus rings or even skip a section of the level. Pay attention to the moving platforms and you'll be rewarded with an extra life or invincibility. Little touches like a secret stash of rings really surprised me as a kid, and even today their inclusion adds a bit of depth to the game missing from lesser titles. Springyard Zone also marks an increase in difficulty. This mainly comes in the form of pattern recognition in this half-pipe style section. A spike or two will rotate around a central platform. You can either try to race through the platform, which is risky but fast, or time to jump onto the central platform, which is slower but a safer way to progress. In a way, it really sums up Sonic the Hedgehog. You can either race through the acts as quick as possible, or take it slow and steady. The trio of levels again ends with a fight against Eggman. Here, Eggman will wander back and forth and then drop down on Sonic to take away a platform. As Eggman is just out of reach, you have to attack when he makes his way downward. Additionally, as Eggman always drops down on Sonic, you can actually control which blocks Eggman removes from play, offering a bit of strategy lacking in the earlier encounters. Upon defeat, Eggman again retreats and Sonic is off to Labyrinth Zone. Again, the pace of Sonic the Hedgehog is changed quite drastically. Most of the 3 acts take place underwater. This gave the designers at Sonic Team a chance to show off a neat graphical trick, swapping the color palette halfway down the screen, simulating a nifty transparency effect on hardware that can't do transparencies. In addition to looking impressive, the controls are also drastically changed. Sonic moves a lot slower underwater, and his momentum significantly reduced. As a kid, I found this to be a really difficult gimmick to contend with. Completely changing the controls at the halfway point was almost too much for me to handle. Now, as a seasoned connoisseur of 16-bit platformers, I don't find it to be an issue at all. First, it again increases the difficulty curve, which has been rather progressive up to this point. Second, the slower pace allowed Sonic Team to add in some new pattern-based hazards. This comes in the form of rotating spikes on chains as well as spears. The spikes are generally well thought out, and the level terrain allows Sonic a few safe places to land as the spike rotates above, around, and then below him. If you get impatient, you'll likely take damage, but if you take a few moments to recognize the pattern, you'll make quick work of them. The spears come in 2 flavors, horizontal and vertical. These all move at exactly the same pace, which is nice, but you still have to get a feel for their movement, as well as Sonic's reduced momentum, in order to clear them without taking damage. It can be challenging at first, but these are all spaced and placed in a way where success is most definitely in reach. Though the waiting around can be a bit of a momentum killer. The other momentum killer is the air bubbles. It seems hedgehogs can't breathe underwater, and Sonic will drown if you don't stop and wait for some air bubbles to reset the drowning timer. Again, these are a momentum killer, and certainly my least favorite gimmick in the game. Labyrinth Zone's problems don't stop there, however. The annoying spike placement from Marble Zone returns, and without already having knowledge of their placement, the game will guide you right into them, causing poor Sonic to lose all of his valuable rings. It can also be easy to fall on top of enemies. As there is no way to turn Sonic into a ball while falling, you just sort of get stuck falling onto enemies, and there is nothing you can do about it. Of course, you can always make sure you jump off a ledge instead of walk off it, but the game encourages you to walk or run, and you are then punished for doing just that. The boss of Labyrinth Zone is unlike any of the other encounters found in the entire game. Instead of hitting Eggman 8 times, you have to make your way up a gauntlet of fire-breathing statues and moving spears, while underwater, of course. This section contains no air bubbles either, so you are only afforded a mistake or two, or risk drowning. This gauntlet is perhaps the toughest section found in Sonic the Hedgehog, and may have been better served as a final level. Still, it is well designed, and every single obstacle is placed to near perfection. Every single jump here is within reason, and nothing is impossible. The patterns here are simple, but you can't race through them. You have to move deliberately, and slop is not tolerated. After reaching the top, Eggman retreats yet again, and we're off to Starlight Zone. For the most part, Starlight Zone returns Sonic back to the speed found in Green Hill Zone. The loop-de-loops, which have been absent since Green Hill Zone, return, which is a nice reprieve after the plodding pace of Labyrinth Zone. Things aren't all easy though, the difficulty remains high. First, the enemies here are basically invincible. Sonic the Hedgehog starts with enemies that can be defeated from any angle. In Marble Zone, some enemies have spikes and can only be hit on their head. Springyard Zone adds this guy who cannot be hit when he is hiding in his shell, as well as these spiked enemies which you can only roll into. However, in Starlight Zone, you have to avoid all of the enemies, period. I have to say, I do appreciate the progression of the enemies. Making things even trickier, these bomb guys explode, so you need to keep your distance after you trigger their timers. This can feel very chaotic at first, but Sonic almost always has a place to run to and avoid their blast damage. Starlight Zone does add some fun platforming elements, however. First are these seesaw-style things which launch Sonic into the air. They work well and allow the designers to really play with the vertical aspects of the level design. There are also some collapsing stairs mixed in with some fireballs, adding some more pattern-based hazards into the mix, which I rather enjoy. That isn't to say these acts are perfect either. Again, there are moments where the level design forces you into hazards you didn't see coming. Here, for example, I am moving right, and then a fireball comes at me moving left, leaving me little chance to get out of the way. In another area, I make a preemptive jump in a similar looking area, and get hit by a badnik. It's kind of annoying. One could argue the fact that Sonic can simply nab a ring and continue on his journey negates these occasionally cheap elements, but I find the entire ring's gimmick feels like a crutch at times. This crutch allowed the designers to gloss over a few rough patches. I would have liked to see some of the hazard placement cleaned up because the rings serve a second purpose. While gathering 100 consecutive rings rewards you with an extra life, if you manage to have 50 or more, a bonus ring is shown at the signpost marking the end of an act. Jump into this ring and Sonic is whisked away to a special stage. In what would be a tradition for a majority of the 2D Sonic titles, the special stages seem very much like tech demos, allowing Sega to show, despite being 2 years technologically behind the Super Nintendo, the Genesis was still a very powerful machine. Here in Sonic the Hedgehog, Sega shows off some pseudo-rotation effects. Basically, Sonic is in a maze rotating around him. It looks nice for sure, and certainly fooled me as a kid. Unfortunately, these really aren't very fun to play. The goal is to find the Chaos Emerald hidden in the maze. It's usually surrounded by some gems you have to break through, increasing the challenge. Unfortunately, there are end goals littered about the maze, and it can be all too easy to get forced into one of these with no opportunity to recover or escape. This leads me back to some of those cheap enemies and hazards, which can more or less rob you the opportunity to collect 50 rings and even attempt the special stages to earn a Chaos Emerald in the first place. Anyway, moving on, we arrive at Eggman number 5. Eggman will drop bombs onto the seesaws, and then Sonic can jump on the seesaw to launch the bomb into the Doctor. While this seems tough at first, it's actually easy to get Eggman into a loop, and you can just repeatedly launch the center bomb into him while being far enough away from the other exploding bombs. Upon defeat, Eggman retreats to his secret South Island base, Scrap Brain Zone. Like the 5 zones preceding it, Scrap Brain Zone offers a few new gimmicks not yet seen, including disappearing platforms, rotating platforms, and these spinning anti-gravity discs. I have to say, I'm kind of impressed Sonic Team was able to keep the momentum going here in the final zone, and I appreciate they basically added new gimmicks into each and every zone. However, there is one section in Act 1 that always trips me up. There is a section here with just one too many gimmicks to contend with. You have to traverse these rotating platforms while a fire blast turns on and off at the end. Needless to say, you're probably going to either fall through the platforms or run into the fire, or both. Of course, below this section isn't a solid platform to catch your fall, but rather more moving platforms. If you're lucky, you'll land on a platform and continue on an alternate path. More often than not, you'll simply fall to your death. It's an incredibly cheap piece of level design, and on all 4 of my recorded playthroughs for this video, this section was responsible for over half the deaths I experienced in the entire game. Now would probably be a good time to bring up the continues. Sonic the Hedgehog has limited continues, and you can only earn them in the bonus stages. First-time players are probably going to see the game over screen on their first couple of attempts, as you have to have 50 rings at the end of the stage to reach the bonus stage, and as the bonus stage can be a bit of a crapshoot, collecting the 50 rings necessary for a continue in the bonus stages is hard. When you combine this section of Scrap Brain Zone with limited or no continues at all, you'll probably reach a game over screen and have to start the entire journey all over again. By 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog probably should have had unlimited continues, a password system, or fewer trial and error moments. Act 2 is also a real pain in the butt, filled with conveyor belts leading you into hazards, as well as plenty of electricity to punish you for jumping. This is where Sonic the Hedgehog really leans on the rings as a crutch for sloppy and unfinished level design. It's an easy level to clear for sure, but only because you can keep recapturing rings to continue the journey. Needless to say, it is not very satisfying. While Scrap Brain Act 1 and 2 feel a bit half-baked, Act 3 is actually pretty solid. The adventure again returns underwater, and the level design again returns to the high standard featured in a majority of the game thus far. It's a worthy final level with plenty of tough underwater platforming combined with challenging hazard patterns to deal with. I really have no complaints here. It's a worthy final level, relatively short, and exactly what you would expect before the final showdown with Dr. Robotnik. Like the rest of the Eggman battles up to this point, the final showdown with Dr. Robotnik is fairly easy and straightforward. Basically, you need to avoid 4 electric sparks, which are very easy to dodge, and then jump into the piston Eggman is hiding in. There is a safe section along the right side of the screen, allowing you to avoid getting crushed by the pistons. In fact, this safe zone zaps most of the challenge from the entire encounter. Per usual, 8 hits later, and the Mad Doctor goes down. From here, there are 2 different endings one can receive. First is the bad ending. Sonic races through Green Hill Zone and then stops, breaking the 4th wall, giving the player a disappointed look before jumping into the screen. After the credits, Eggman will appear on the screen with the Chaos Emerald Sonic failed to collect, advising you to try again. If you do manage to collect all 6 Chaos Emeralds, however, the ending is slightly different. Instead of Sonic giving you a disappointed look, he throws the 6 Chaos Emeralds into the air, a few special flowers appear, and then Sonic looks back and forth, wondering where they went off to, before jumping into the screen. After the credits, Eggman is having a tantrum, jumping on text, signifying the true end of the game. It's not much of a reward if I'm honest, but I'm finally happy to have knocked this achievement off my bucket list. In any case, let's go ahead and take a look at those credits. With all of the gameplay out of the way, let's move on to the graphics. In my opinion, Sonic the Hedgehog is still a gorgeous game. Sega was looking for something to really show off the untapped power of the Sega Genesis, and I feel Sonic Team really knocked it out of the park. Despite a limited color palette, Sonic the Hedgehog is a bright and colorful game with a nice mix of bold primary colors and subtle shading effects. The overall style is simply stunning, and the art style is still being copied to this very day. Technically speaking, Sonic the Hedgehog is sound. It does a great job with parallax scrolling, giving most of the areas a ton of depth. While I wish a few of the areas had more scrolling, which I believe were partially resolved in future revisions, there are still plenty of areas with multiple layers, something not found very often on the competing Super Nintendo and TurboGrafx-16. Even more impressive is the frame rate. Sonic the Hedgehog mostly stays at a silky smooth 60 frames per second. The frame rate does tend to suffer when Sonic loses a massive amount of rings, however, and there is some noticeable flicker, especially when you have the invincibility power-up. But as a whole, Sonic the Hedgehog remains a technical marvel and a visual treat few Genesis games were able to top in the ensuing years. And then there is the audio. The first couple years of the Sega Genesis were marked with a lot of Genesis twang, showcasing the horrible synthesized instruments bundled with the Genesis development kit. Sonic the Hedgehog, on the other hand, is about as smooth as it gets. None of the harshness plaguing many early titles is present at all, and instead we are left with rich instruments and pleasant synthesized beats. In addition to the amazing quality of the sound are the compositions themselves. Across the board, each and every track is both complex with plenty of layers and progression, but also catchy. I would consider all of them to be the ultimate earworms. Seriously, every single song is sure to get stuck in your head. They are that memorable. As much as I love the gameplay and the graphics, there is little doubt the music here has aged arguably better than anything else in the entire game. So, with all of that out of the way, we arrive back at the question asked at the beginning of the video: is Sonic the Hedgehog still good? Let me start by saying, with doing my best to remove my nostalgia goggles and doing the best I can to critique this game from an objective viewpoint, I can see Sonic the Hedgehog is not as perfect as I once remembered. There are definitely obvious design issues, from annoying enemies to questionable spike placement and some awkwardly placed air bubbles in Labyrinth Zone. Even after 20 years of experience, memorization is not enough, and some things in Sonic the Hedgehog are just plain cheap. Some things are broken too. Sonic is usually invincible for a few moments after losing rings, which is reasonable and, well, correct. However, Sonic is not immune to spikes during the invincibility period. Some things insta-kill Sonic no matter what, like crushing items, but the spikes are the only thing in the entire game that don't normally insta-kill Sonic when he has rings, but do during the invincibility period. Whether this inconsistency was intentional or not has never been determined, but it is exceptionally annoying and not found in later entries to the series. Needless to say, I can definitely see how Sonic the Hedgehog may leave a bad first impression to newcomers. However, on the flip side, I also have to say many of the problems often cited with Sonic's first entry are vastly overstated. I've reviewed over 5 hours of recorded footage representing 4 playthroughs, taking a look at every time I received damage, every time I finished a level with less than 50 rings, and took a look at each and every death. And quite frankly, most of my deaths were my fault, be it walking off a ledge, sloppy play, rushing a section, not dodging a projectile, or paying attention to a platform. While there are cheat moments for sure, these are few and far between. Sonic the Hedgehog certainly isn't the easiest game ever, but it's also far from the 8-bit hard titles of the NES era. A vast majority of the challenge in Sonic the Hedgehog is in fact extremely fair, requiring a bit of patience and skill to be successful. Running and jumping around haphazardly won't result in success, nor should it. At the end of the day, Sonic the Hedgehog gets the two fundamental platforming elements correct. First, Sonic controls with precision and finesse, and second, has worthwhile levels to platform through. While annoying once in a while for sure, there are virtually no truly frustrating sections to speak of. This makes Sonic the Hedgehog an absolute treat for a majority of its runtime. With Act 1 and 2 of Scrap Brain Zone being exceptions, those levels kind of suck, but the other 16 acts are pure platforming fun. There are also plenty of little touches showing Sonic Team did care. In every level there are rings or an invincibility power-up before you ever encounter an enemy or hazard. Speaking of invincibility power-ups, these are generally thoughtfully placed in areas, allowing you to breeze through tricky sections, rewarding you for actually seeking them out. This thoughtfulness increases my enjoyment of the game. There are also an insane amount of secrets to discover. Even after 20 plus years of playing Sonic the Hedgehog, I still discovered a few new areas when recording footage for this video, which is ridiculously awesome. When you combine an awesome graphical presentation with a legendary soundtrack, varied level design in terms of pace as well as set pieces, decent bosses, a progressive difficulty curve, and some of the tightest controls of all time, what you are left with is an amazing game. Sonic the Hedgehog is a classic, and 25 years later is nearly every bit as awesome as it was in 1991.